election fraud. You want to jump into that real quick and tell us what you think? Because on this show, we're election integrity activists, as well as, having a show here. And that's something we go into hard. We study deep. We talk to a lot of professions. We followed the whole LA election last time. I feel that Bernie Sanders' biggest sin is the fact that he hasn't called out election fraud and challenged some of this voting. And not even the fact, tell everybody, educate everybody that all our computers and our systems, our software are owned by corporations. There's proprietary software. What's your thought on election fraud in general?
So I think that it happens, and I think that we have a lot of problems confronting the legitimacy of our elections. I wouldn't fault Bernie for not making a bigger deal of it, only because he's a candidate. And frankly, we are in particularly vulnerable positions to challenge the fairness of the processes that we're auditioning to be evaluated under. That really has to come from other actors. And I would say that the divergences between the exit polls and the observed official results are more than suspicious. That's enough in any other context for people to declare the results illegitimate. I really wish that the press would demonstrate some independence here. And I applaud your view of these issues. I think the fact that the corporate media, and I'd even also fault the international media for accepting the cue of the corporate media and describing our election results as legitimate, even when there's objective indicia to the contrary. I think that's an irresponsible act of journalism, and I think we're all paying a cost as a result. On the particular threat vectors that threaten the legitimacy of our elections, I want to expand the frame. I'll put it this way. You don't need a computer to hack an election. The GOP has been hacking our elections in broad daylight for decades.
So have the Democrats.
And
so have the Democrats.
But just to locate how, every time they purge the rolls and qualified voters who are entitled to vote are denied the opportunity, that's hacking an election. Every time a Secretary of State denies voting machines to an urban enclave where then you have these waits for hours long and people go home and before casting a vote, that's hacking an election. Every time you have well-funded candidates going to the polls, raising 20 times their competitors because they're sucking up corporate cash, that's hacking an election. Our elections at multiple different points in the process suffer from legitimacy problems. And so I just want to make that point that our elections are ridden with holes. The role of money in constructing campaign finance, the role of money in policy, in the lobbying apparatus, the way that we count votes with exclusive points for first place in most elections. I have the opportunity to be Nancy Pelosi's first November challenger from within the party ever. And the reason why is because in California, we have a somewhat unique structure for congressional elections, the jungle primary, that in a place like San Francisco allows points for second place. And so I'm in the November election as the second place vote getter in March. That might sound like a not big deal, but giving points for second place is the difference between having a multiplicity of parties and having two parties. And as long as you have a two-party system, it's going to be really hard to get to anything meaningfully resembling democracy because the parties will treat each side of the election spectrum, as it were, as hostages. We, the American people, are held largely hostage by the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. Where do you go if you're not one of those parties? Well, in most of America, there is no place for you politically. That's one of the reasons why I'm running against the head of the Democratic Party, and I'm ultimately aiming to democratize the United States. And I think the key impediment to us having a meaningful democracy is the corporate leadership of the party that describes itself falsely as democratic.
Yeah.
I'm going to push back unless you got something.
Yeah, well, and I was just going to say, like in California, for instance, in Los Angeles, we had one of the worst elections of our time. I mean, we had provisional ballots being given to people because they couldn't find them in the system, even though they've been registered for years. We had the machines not working, spitting out ballots. We had 3, 4, 5, 6-hour-long lines. That is a form of voter suppression. It's also a form of voter suppression when you tell people they have 11 days to vote, but the machines aren't ready yet. All of this is forms of voter suppression, but election fraud is also something that not only the Republican Party does, but the Democratic Party. We have Secretary of State Alex Padilla and Dean Logan, who is the clerk, and they knew we were talking about all these problems before March 3rd, and they knew, and they didn't do anything about it. They led people to feel like everything was fine. And that is the corruption, and that corruption comes from obviously the top. And I agree with you that Bernie Sanders may not be in a position to necessarily say something, but I think the time for that has passed. I think right now, more than ever, obviously the people need to speak out about it, and the corporate media is obviously going to ignore it, which is why we do it. But I mean, I need to see it more from people, from candidates running for Congress, because are we ever going to get anything that we want, whether it's the Green New Deal, Medicare for all, when we have not only to fight the Democrats and the Republicans, but also the system that enables them to continuously stay on top. We've seen the situation between Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Tim Canova. We've also seen other progressives go against these big corporate politicians, and it's very, very hard for us to win. And sometimes it is because not enough people are aware of the progressive issues. But more often than not, I think it's because the system is set up against us. And that is something that I think we have to more stop being afraid to call it election fraud in general from our entire government, and start talking about it as a non-taboo thing. Because when we talk about it as a taboo thing, then people start like being afraid to even say the words, oh, it's rigged, or this is fraud, etc.
I mean, my first case as a young lawyer in 2003, even before I graduated from law school, I was working on a case defending the House co-sponsors, Shays and Meehan, of the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2003. This was the McCain-Feingold attempt to take corporate soft money out of elections. So like, I get it. The first work I did in my legal career was trying to defend a bipartisan congressional attempt to take corporate soft money out of elections to diminish the reality and appearance of corruption. And when we were successful in that case before the DC Circuit, before the Supreme Court, in the Citizens United decision, then reversed effectively the rules that we helped establish in those cases. And so I'm absolutely on board, and I absolutely agree that it needs to be a clamoring, a chorus of voices. Yeah. And I think for us as candidates, and I do talk about the threats to our election legitimacy as policy issues, but for a campaign having in the wake of an election to allege election fraud is just a challenging position to be in. And I'd much rather see those observations coming from academics, poll watchers, international observers, and journalists, because they're in strong positions to report the fact. Whereas anyone will perceive a politician or a campaign's presentation of the facts as inevitably and inherently self-interested and inflected with that view. And so I think this is a real need for real independent journalism of the sort that you all are practicing. I really hope that more journalists can take your cue and invite attention to these issues. And every time an exit poll diverges from the result, that divergence should be the top line of every news report on that election. And too often we see what passes for news reduced to stenography. Here's their official result. Well, if it doesn't match the exit polls, say that, because people need to know. I really do agree with you that those are important issues for us to be kept aware of in this important time.
But Shahid, why are you saying that Bernie Sanders doesn't have a responsibility to call it out? He's the one who got cheated. You know what I'm saying? I'm not trying to make this all about, I'm not trying to put everything on Bernie Sanders' shoulder, whatnot. I understand there's a lot of pressure when it comes to this particular subject. It seems to be taboo at sorts. Like I can see some of his campaign managers maybe telling him, hey, listen, don't say there's rigging. You're going to look like a sore loser and it's going to really turn off most of the country. However, this has happened before in 2016 and now it's happening in 2020. Isn't it his position? Shouldn't Bernie Sanders take the position that he has to fight for everyone's vote to be counted and do what's necessary? And at the very least, have a lawsuit against some of these states that have had just serious problems with their exit polls. Go ahead.
I don't think that's a crazy position. I think there's a lot of merit to what you're saying. I certainly think that he has gone to bat for everybody's right to vote. He's talked about it very explicitly and made the point that if you can't win a free and fair election, I think this is a direct quote, get the hell out of politics is what he has said to those figures. So I think he has, on the front end, called for fair elections. I don't think the idea of a lawsuit is crazy. I think it makes sense to defend the integrity of our elections. And I also don't think that he shouldn't talk about it. The only point I'm raising here is that I think the people that we rely on to share facts, namely reporters, journalists, that's what the press is for, to call out misrepresentations, to observe where the official facts and the facts on the ground diverge. That's not to say that politicians can't or shouldn't do that. We do. I think Bernie does. I certainly do. Just the point I'm making is that I don't think we are in the strongest position to do it, because people will recognize anything we say as inflected by a political perspective, as distinct from an empirical commitment to what is happening on the ground. We're all very embedded in facts. I mean, it is the fact of human misery and suffering that drives me to advocate for Medicare for all. It is the fact of climate chaos in our species, runaway corporate resource extraction racket in driving it that is driving me to advocate for the Green New Deal. I just mean to say that I think looking to politicians to critique the legitimacy of the election infrastructure places us in an unfortunate position. And frankly, I think there are stronger voices to make that case. And I think that again, that journalists are the strongest actors to reflect upon the difference between fact and spin in our society. And the fact that so many of your counterparts, particularly, in the institutional media, refuse to call out the spin and present it as uncritical fact, I think that's, 9/10 of the reason we're in this mess, that we've been spoon-fed supposed facts that are anything but for decades. And I think the real facts of the matter are that working people fuel our economy. Working people always take it on the chin. In times of crisis, we get abused even more relentlessly. And at the end of the day, we have elected representatives who, in more cases than not, are out there defending our corporate masters instead of our families and our students and our working and our neighbors in between jobs. Working class Americans are the ones who need representation and need a voice right now. And I hear you saying that voice hasn't been present, that our elections don't heed our voices either. Could not agree with you more. At the end of the day, all I can hope for is that enough of my neighbors turn out to support our voices, that the illegitimacies and obstacles confronting our victories are insufficient to keep us from victory. And I'll be very eager to legislate those reforms that you think like replicate the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act that the Supreme Court struck down, ensure national vote-by-mail opportunities, ensure same-day registration opportunities, and go to bat for those values at times when, unfortunately, both Republicans and many Democrats have chosen not to.
Yeah, and I see no problem with fighting for transparency. These elections are owned by our corporations, and that's something that's going to be pointed out. And I think it's up to the politicians or the candidates who are running for the progressives to educate people. I mean, Fiorella is doing a story right now. She just released a video about what's going on in Wisconsin. I don't think the general public understands that the early voting is more moderate to conservative and the late voting is more liberal to progressive. And that's just a pattern that goes throughout our history as far as voting. And when the Democrats pull these moves, and Fiorella's they're still going on in Wisconsin right now. We need the people who are running to represent us, to fight for our votes, to point out and educate those points. And the fact that we are in a proprietary software system, we can't even look in, like when people say, you can't prove to me that it's rigged, I'm like, you can't prove to me that it's not rigged because we can't simply look into the black box. We don't own it and we pay for it, but yet we don't own it.
Auditable elections are critical. I want to absolutely meet you there. There's no reason to have elections being conducted by proprietary information. There's no legitimate role for proprietary information in so crucial a public process. I mean, Absolutely. I would say that there's no role for proprietary information and algorithms in any public process. We think about bail and sentencing determinations often being informed by artificial intelligence and machine learning. That's all illegitimate too. If it's a public decision, it should be a transparent decision. And if it's a private algorithm or a piece of software, it's not transparent by definition. We need to have auditable elections where we can verify the results in order to have trust in them. If a reporter can't verify the results of an election, they shouldn't report the results as legitimate, presumptively, especially when there's divergences from the exit poll. So I agree with you. We who are seeking elections should be calling these issues out. I just want to, again, invite the press to be part of that process, because without it, I don't think that message is going to get heard. And again, I'm very thankful for you, using your platform to draw attention to these issues. I think more journalists need to do it.
All right. Thank you.
Anything else?
No.